Hey guys, what's up? Back with another video on the Yorion blue-white control deck. Um, and kind of like probably the last and final update for this deck. I've been playing this deck for, let's say about 3 to 4 months now. Grinding out a bunch of cards for it, grinding out gold for the style cards and everything. So, making everything look kind of nice. And um, yeah, after 3, 4 months of playing the deck, I feel like I have a fairly decent idea of how the deck works, how it should be kind of piloted, or in some of the good cards, some of the cards I liked, some of the cards I didn't like, change some lands, change some sideboard stuff, main deck, and all of that jazz. And so I want to talk about a bit of the changes I made to the deck today. And going forward, I think I'm going to try to go ahead and move on to playing Esper Control. Probably going to still stick with the 80 card Yorion deck, or style, and see if we can pilot that deck to, um, or at least make it good enough to pilot through some of the ranks here. Right now, I'm sitting at, I think, Plat 2. I haven't recorded too many gameplays of the deck lately. Just been kind of playing one game here and there. Sometimes, an hour here and there. So, um, I haven't really got around to just sitting down for like 2 hours and just recording all my gameplay, but I'll probably eventually do that since this deck is more or less in its final state and where I think where I personally like it at. Um, but yeah, let's go through some cards. There's probably a lot of stuff I already have mentioned in my other videos, so I'm gonna try not to double back on it too much. And maybe I'll just talk about like my experiences with the cards in the past like 3 months of playing it or so. So, in general, the deck certainly has a lot of variance when you're drawing, or just when you're playing the deck in general. Um, in terms of lands, the 34 land count seems to work fine. We have a lot of cycling through Shark Typhoon, Censor, and Omen of the Sea, and a small part of with Search for Escalanta. So, with all those combinations so far, I feel the deck hasn't run into any sort of like land drop, and we haven't really um, come to the point where we flood it out too hard. There are times where you will flood out with the deck. Having cycle on the lands kind of help occasionally, and having Castle Vantress kind of helps with mitigating the flood. But it still will happen. But for the most part, I think the deck has run relatively smoothly. We're generally able to get to our fifth and sixth land. That's where we want to be when piling the deck. It'll allow us to at least cast Teferi, Farewell, you know, Shark Typhoon, and all that jazz. Now, the main issue with the deck, if you're unfamiliar, is card quality. Because we're playing two colors, and Pioneers is relatively a smaller card pool of cards, especially when it comes to counterspell. Our card quality isn't as great compared to like modern or legacy blue-white control. So because of that, we have to use a lot of cards that are pretty subpar, and that would kind of put us at a disadvantage while we're using it. For example, Portable Hole, Faithful Absence, March. They're all great cards in their own, but they all have their disadvantages, and their disadvantages are pretty bad compared to other cards that are available in the game of Magic. For example, Portable Hole, while it's just 1 mana and it gets rid of anything 2 and less, its limitation that it's an artifact and it just like prisons something and you can't go anything higher than 3 CMC. So you have cards like in Modern with Prismatic Ending, a lot better than Portable Hole. Same thing, Prismatic Ending kind of outclasses March in some sense. March is good because it's an instant speed and it can hit lands. So that's the bigger big trade-off here. The main trade-off, I think, or the main like weakness of the deck is the counterspell and the removal for big creatures or planeswalkers, which is gonna be Faithful Absent, which is okay. It does the job. It's certainly flexible, but it gives your opponent a draw. And as a control player, you don't really want to be giving your opponents cards to play. I'd rather discard a card and use Faithful Absent rather than use Faithful Absent and give my opponent a card. Kind of like the idea behind Solitude. If you play Modern, you'd rather um, play Solitude over something like Path of Exile, because Path of Exile, you're giving your opponent a land, and that's always a bad idea. Where Faithful Absence is giving your opponent a card, but there's nothing else that's better or flexible as Faithful Absence, so we're kind of forced to playing it. If we're playing Esper, we have better card quality. We have Vanishing Verse. You have um, the counter spell, Drown and Lock. You have Fatal Pushes, stuff like that. Better card removal than Faithful Absent. And same thing with counter spells. We don't really have a solid counter spell in this format um, for 2 mana. Censor seems to be the best since you're able to sometimes counter something. If not, you can just cycle it and use it as kind of like a really slow opt to dig for lands and stuff like that. Or in case you're flooding out, or Censor is late in the late game, it's useless. You can just pitch it. I definitely like Censor over Jawari. Jawari just feels terrible. Jawari is not a great counterspell, and it's not a great land either. So you're kind of, um, yeah, I just don't recommend playing Jawari as much. Censor, at least it's a cycle card, and can help you out if you're like flooding to try to dig through your deck for something better than a counterspell. Dig for answers or dig for threats. Where Jawari, you're just stuck on either keeping it in your hand or playing it as a tap land. So that's my opinion on that. Search for Escanta, I still like the one of. When it comes up, it definitely, like late game, it definitely does help you kind of dig for your answer and win in certain matchups. So I still like the one of. You can definitely play two. Um, but with the stack of like removal and counter spells, I decided just to play the one. In terms of our hard counter, Absorb or Saw It Come In is probably be your best hard counters. Maybe Sinister Surveil um, might be another choice, but I think gaining the 3 health really does help you help you keep yourself in the game. So I definitely think I prefer Absorb over all the other available counter spells, hard counters. Only issue is that it's very demanding, so you gotta play your lands right in the first 3 turns. Otherwise, there will be times where you won't be able to cast Absorb if you have like 2 white lands and an island or something like that. That's the main weakness I found of Absorb, is that it's very color intensive. Our mana base is generally very supportive of it. We can usually get 2 blue and 1 white by turn 3, so I think it's worth playing 3 copies of it, or sorry, 4 copies of it, and then healing off those copies to keep yourself in the game. Because with 80 cards, you're not gonna always draw your removal, so you're definitely gonna be taking a lot of like hits from a bunch of weenies in the early stages of the game. Once you start stabilizing, and if you're able to clear the board and stuff, you're still under threat of like direct damage and stuff like that. So Absorbs kind of helps you bring you out of that like range in the later part of the game, especially when you need health, and health is not a resource. So in a sense, Absorb gives you another resource so that you can take more hits, maybe stuff like that. So I think Absorb is probably going to be your best choice here. Narset, not as great anymore because Izzet is kind of dead. I haven't really seen any Izzet decks lately. With the banning of expressive alliteration, the Izzet archetype has kind of been in a slum. So Narset, you can even cut her completely if you want to. I still like her. There's cases where resolve a Narset against maybe a mirror match and they just lose, because now their 5 mana Teferi just doesn't do anything other than tap 2 lands, unless they want to minus Teferi for 3 to put her back on my deck. But then he'll die to like a shark token or something. So that's why I like Narset for is the when you play against other control matchups, she will kind of put the brakes on their decks, and she kind of helps mitigate Faithful Absence, so they can't just draw on their turn. They have to wait until your turn to draw, which is good because now they're leaving mana open. They're not casting their bigger spells. If they need draws, they have to play around Narset. Um, and then lastly, I think everything else here is fairly stable. I feel pretty comfortable with 4 copies of each. Um, 3 copies of the Deluge has been really good. Sometimes some people play across the multiverse, I think, or something multiverse. It's the Foretell 2, Draw 2. That is not a bad card per se, because you can play it on your turn 2 if you have nothing else to do, and then eventually draw 2. But Memory Deluge, I think, its flashback has been really good. Definitely, there's games where you're grinding it out with your opponent. You have like 7, 8 lands, and you have like maybe 1 card, 2 cards in your hand, and you have a deluge in your grave. That deluge will push you ahead and will essentially kind of secure you the game. So I definitely like deluge over the multiverse card, or any other draw cards at the moment. Now, if we had Dig Through Time or Treasure Cruise, then maybe those might fit in the deck somewhere. Um, but as of right now, I think at least in the Explorer format, Deluge is pretty good. Verdict, no questions asked. It's the best removal we got in terms of just a board wipe. Every other removal is pretty subpar, so I wouldn't even think about playing anything other than Verdict. The only other 4 mana one that you can think about playing is Settle the Wreckage if you need some instant speed board wipe. Outside of that, Triple Verdict's been pretty good for me. I don't think I would play a 4th copy. That's too much. I do play Farewell, so that kind of helps. And Farewell has been pretty good this format. There's a lot of valuable enchantments and artifacts and graveyard that you want to remove. And so late game Farewell has been kind of like one of that reset cards for me, especially if you have like a Planeswalker, you have the Wandering Emperor or Teferi on the board, and you wipe the board, the graveyard, and all of that. It pushes you into a really good, stable winning position. So I think 3 verdicts good enough, and then 2 farewells, kind of for redundancy and the fact that you want to see it, especially in blue white since you don't really have that many good removal compared to like Esper. So I think 3/2's been a pretty good number for me here. And then last off, we have 4 Shark Typhoons. Now, this might be a lot. Like, you could probably cut this down if you're running into more difficult times dealing with smaller threats. You might want to play another portable or maybe another counter spell or something, or some other form of removal. For me, I like 4 of them because I like cycling them sometimes on turn 2 just to see if I can get a land drop, because it still happens. Like we're playing in essence 12 cantrips, um, Omen, Shark, and Censor to kind of try to hit your land drops. And there's been times where I cycle, play Omen, I still don't hit a land drop, and that has happened because we are playing 80 cards. So these cards just kind of help you dig through your deck for answers, and they can be a threat themselves, especially Shark Typhoons. If you do a 3/3 Shark, 2/2 Shark, or you pump it up with the Emperor, Shark sometimes will just win you the game outright if they can't remove it or they don't want to spend removal on the Shark token. So that's from my experience. In rare occurrences, you'll go ahead and hard cast it as an enchantment, but that's very rare. So um, you mostly just gotta cycle the card or make a body off of it, and then in the rare occurrence, you'll hard cast it as an enchantment. But that's if it's a win more card at that point. If you're in a winning position that you can afford to play a Shark Typhoon um, as an enchantment, then yeah, I'm not too sure what your opponent's gonna be. You know, what he would have had to answer this outside of like a farewell or something like that. And that's another good thing. Like a farewell is good against like other Shark Typhoons. If they're playing Shark Typhoon, they like hard cast it and they don't have any like counter spells, um, or any sort of like way to stop your farewell. You kind of reset the board in your favor in that sense too. Anyways, that's enough of the main deck. Um, the ratios here I feel are pretty good. The reason why I played 3 Faithful Absence because this, if you haven't heard, Blue White has a really tough time dealing with a Planeswalker that has resolved. Your only real way to deal with the Planeswalkers that has resolved is either with Teferi, the Faithful, or Emperor and Shark Typhoon. And that's another reason why we play 4 Shark Typhoon. It's to put a body on the board so we can challenge other Planeswalkers, and the fact that it's got flying means that a majority of your opponent's creatures can't block this thing. So that's like the main purpose of the Shark Typhoon. Um, I wouldn't go playing 4. I think 4 is too much, but 3 has been working pretty well. 90% of the time, you should be able to stop most Planeswalkers from resolving. Sometimes it's tricky. Like I had during my opponent's turn, I would maybe flash Memory Deluge, and they would flash a Wandering Emperor in response, which is fine because now their Emperor is a little bit weaker. But you get your memory, but now you have to deal with an Emperor and probably a Samurai token. But yeah, in either case, you don't want to let your opponent's Planeswalkers resolve, otherwise you're gonna most likely lose there. Okay, let's move on to land real quick here. In terms of the land, um, I decided to cut down on a lot of the castles. I used to play 2 Arendelle and then 2 Vantress. But now I just play the 1 of each because you really don't need them and you really don't have that much mana open most of the time to either scry or to make a 1/1 token. They're there for off chances that you have a lot of mana and you have nothing else to do with it, then great, you can dump that mana into this. I much prefer dumping my mana into Storm Giants to clock my opponent or to remove their Planeswalkers or something like that. So I prefer having a bigger man land. So you can do Hall of the Storm Giant, or you can do the white one. I forgot which the white one was called. But I think I've only preferred the Hall because it's the biggest thing, and it's got ward, so it's hard to remove. Um, but yeah, I think you could do maybe 1 Hall and one of the other white man lands if you wanted to. But yeah, the other thing is, being 80 card deck, you're not always gonna draw your island and plains type. So sometimes you'll have to play this tapped, and that happens quite a bit through my play testing. That if you have more than one of these castle types, or even a glacial fortress, a check land, if you have too many check lands, there's a very high probability of you not drawing a plane or an island, ironically, and you'll have to play them tapped. And that has happened to me multiple times, which is why I decided to cut them down to 1 each. Um, and that's been working fine. When I needed them, I had them, and yeah, they work great. Otherwise, I don't think I want to double up on them anymore. And the other change I think I made, by taking those out, I was able to add in another Field of Ruin and some more just basic lands. So the Field of Ruins, you want to save this to hit other man lands, or maybe tri lands, or maybe a land if you think your opponent isn't playing any basics. I've run into a couple of games where that has happened, where my opponent isn't playing any sort of basics, and I've been kind of strip mining them with Fill the Runes. Essentially, you kind of just blow up their land, um, and they're just kind of behind on lands, which is nice. Um, and yeah, man lands are hard to deal with in this particular deck. You only have March and Faithful Absence as your only way to remove man lands, and so Fill the Runes gives you another way to remove it. Now, Field is a lot better in Pioneer because you want to be hitting things like Shrine of Nykthos or Nykthos or whatever. Here in Explorer, the mono green Karn decks don't have Nykthos, and so you this card's a little worse because they play a bunch of basics. Sometimes you might hit a green castle, or maybe you'll hit the green Hydra land, man land, or maybe you'll hit a Boseiju. But majority of the time, um, this is great against every other deck except for the mono green Karn in Pioneer or in Explorer because they don't have the Nykthos land. Um, and I think 3 copies is fine. There's been times where this has kind of color screwed me, especially if you're playing it in the first 3 turns. You won't have mana up for absorb, so just be careful of that. That's just the main con of it. Is if you play Feel the Rune, hopefully you don't have absorb in your hand just yet. But yeah, that's the 2 main things is having the correct colors for absorb, and then Feel the Rune is one of those cards that is really good in certain matchups, but can also um, screw you color wise in the deck. Because namely absorbs the most color intensive card that you'll be playing. Ironically, Supreme Verdict, by the time you get to turn 4, you should have enough mana for this double white and blue is really double blue and double white is really easy to achieve by turn 4, but double blue and 1 white is sometimes pretty difficult to achieve. So in my games, I want to say I get there about 70% of the time, but there are that like 30% of the time where you just don't have the colors to cast the absorb, and that kind of really sucks. So that's just um one of those things where it's you just kind of have to eat it at that point, and just kind of pray. And then the rest of the lands is just foils of everything else. Um, just give me those sort of double colors there, and then just 1 Inganjo and 1 Otawara. I almost never use Otawara for the channeling ability, but it's there just in case. I have definitely used Inganjo quite a bit. It's a really good removal spell, or I guess removal ability. So I almost want to say you can safely double up on this, and then just use this as keep in your hand as a removal spell. Where Otawara hasn't really like returned anything that I cared for. Maybe you could hit like a Shark Typhoon, or maybe hit a Teferi or something like that and then counter it. But outside of that, I think Iganjo is a better land in this particular deck. Alright, let's move on to the side deck real quick. Let me just switch this. Is this any better? I don't think so. Okay. I'm just gonna keep it like that then. So, I went back and forth from the side deck. I did remove the I forgot what the card was, but the card that basically gives you like 2 bodies, draws you a card, and heals you 4. I forgot the name of it. I found that card super situational, and I was just never able to like properly cast it when I needed it. So I just took it out completely. Decided to play some other cards. So Gravedigger's Cage, its main purpose here is to stop the decks that cheat out cards from their decks. So stuff like Festival of Storms or Collective Company. Those are like the main cards Gravedigger's Cage is supposed to kind of hinder. Sometimes you'll hit like a Bolas Citadel or something like that, but majority of the time it's gonna hit the Coco decks essentially. Now you usually want to save a counter spell for those cards, but there are a lot of times where you'll tap out or you won't have a counter spell, and they resolve one of those spells, you're in a heap of trouble. So Gravedigger's Cage really does help with that. It's not really meant to be used as sort of an anti-grave thing. It does you can use it as anti-grave if you wanted to. In theory, Rest in Peace is a better anti-grave card, but Digger's Cage, you namely want to use it for the effects where cards can't come in from the library, because that really um, it's Blue White's control's main weakness, I think, is when your opponent's able to cheat stuff out from their library. You're in just kind of a deep trouble, and it also helps against like creativity and stuff like that. So those are popular decks right now. So creative decks, mono green Karn. Those are the decks that we have trouble dealing with, and so Gravedigger Cage helps with that. Now, obviously, it's Gravedigger's Cage can be removed. They can use Boseiju, Prismari Command, Kolaghan's Command, stuff like that to remove the cage. So the cage is not a sure way to stop your opponent's strategy. It's just a way to kind of buy you some time to help, hopefully buy you enough time so that you can draw your counter spells and just counter their cards. But for 1 mana, I think it's good enough to play. And I've tried taking it out, and then tried playing without it, but I've always kind of missed it, so I ended up putting it back in my deck. So I think it's gonna find a permanent place in most of my blue, white, or Esper style control decks. Next off, Narset's Reversal. Decided to put it back in. Just another anti uncounterable counterspell, I guess. So if you play against Thought Disruption, this kind of helps you play against that. Or if your opponent's countering something or they play some big value spell, you can just steal that value spell for yourself. Now there is one card you don't want to cast Narset's Reversal against, and that's gonna be Memory Deluge. Reason why is if you play Narset's Reversal, you bounce the spell back and you try to copy it, because you copied the spell and you paid 0 mana for it, the Memory Deluge that you copied essentially is gonna look at 0 cards and draw you 0 cards. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, I didn't use it against Narset's. I didn't use Narset's Reversal against Memory Deluge. My opponent did, and I guess he found out the hard way that that's the interaction between the 2 cards there. So yeah, just kind of be careful of that, of what you're casting Narset's Reversal against. If the card requires mana to pay for its cost and you Narset Reversal it, the copy that you're gonna make is probably gonna be useless. But um, it's still a good card to have. It's just a one of. And then Triple Doan's Veto are our second best hard counter in the deck. So no reason not to play a third copy if you are playing against like a combo deck or something like that, and you can't let them resolve their combo cards. This card is great. It's good against Mystical Dispute, good against other counter spells. Just counter the original spell, and then they'll never resolve it. So good card to have a third copy of. All right, so on to the next card here. It's Unlicensed Hearse. This card is really good and can also be bad. It has all the same weaknesses as Gravedigger's Cage. If you're going to use it for anti-grave, it can be removed. And if you do crew this thing and you do make it a creature, it can also be removed while it's a creature. So if they fatal push this, you're kind of out of luck there. What I like about this over like Rest in Peace is that it allows me to still play my Memory Deluge, so it doesn't hit my own grave. It still lets me keep my Memory Deluges in the grave and use it for later in the game. And crewing this is pretty easy for the most part. You either have the Shark tokens to crew it, or you have the Wandering Emperor's Samurai tokens to crew it. So crewing it is not super difficult, and it can be a win condition if you make it big enough. You get it to like a 6/6, an 8/8, or like a 10/10. Your opponent's eventually gonna just die to the the hearse. But it is kind of slow. It is not foolproof, but it is still a great card. So at least in this particular deck, my two main anti graveyard hate is going to be Unlicensed Hearse and Gravedigger's Cage. Now, obviously, Gravedigger's Cage is going to hit my Memory Deluge, but that's fine. You know, like I said, you generally don't want to really side this as a anti-grave card. Especially be careful about siding this against Grease Fang. It does nothing against Grease Fang. Because if you remember, Grease Fang brings back a vehicle artifact, and this doesn't stop vehicle artifacts from coming back from the grave. So, um, yeah, just don't side this against Grease Fang is my main advice here. You want to be siding like unlicensed hearses for sure, and maybe something else. Um, and then Aether Gust here, our biggest weakness is gonna be mono green Karn. Um, Aether Gust is just great removal for basically everything in their deck except for Karn. Now, obviously, for Karn, you just want to, Doan's Veto it or Faithful Absence or something. But yeah, for the rest of the cards in their deck, you just want to, remove it on the stack, or if they do resolve it, try to your best to remove it from their, board using Aether Gust here. Um, if you are able to get your opponent into a lock with Aether Gust, that really does push you ahead. So let's say they're on 5 mana and they're trying to cast Nisa. If they excuse me there, if you Aether Gust Nisa, they go on top of their deck. They have to draw that card again and they have to commit another 5 mana to it, and then you Aether Gust them again. If they decide to top deck it again, they gotta spend another 5 mana to cast it again, and they're kind of soft. You essentially kind of soft fate seal them. So that's why I like the Aether Gust and multiple copies of it, because I've done that to multiple opponents, especially since I'm a more of a modern player. The Aether Gust has definitely been really good in my modern meta. Like it's good enough to play in modern, definitely good enough to play in Pioneer. You know, so while you don't have stuff like Snapcasters to kind of abuse the Aether Gust with, there are still like a lot of decks in this particular format that are playing red and green, and so Aether Gust has always been kind of like that great pseudo counterspell, kind of like a memory lapse. When that was in historic, memory lapse was like the broken counterspell. You force them to commit all that mana to replay the same card that they just you know had, and putting it into the top of their deck is actually really good since you're kind of forcing them to draw the same card again. Now, obviously, if you guys in top decking mode, this card only buys you a turn. But if you're ahead and you have a lot of counter spells and you're ahead on board or ahead on in hand advantage, then Aether Gust kind of fate seals your opponent, which is really nice. Dispute just that too. I don't really think I need any more dispute because you're playing Dovin's Veto already. So dispute is there in case you have like 6 mana and you're trying to resolve with a fairy, and your opponent maybe has like 2 to 3 mana up. Maybe they have, an absorb or they have their own dispute. That's when you try to challenge them. If they have Dovin's Veto, then obviously you can't do anything about that. But if you have enough mana open, you can always cast the dispute to try to challenge them to resolve any of your planeswalkers. It You could also use this as a hard, soft 3 mana counter spell against any other spell, which is still decent. So, not too bad there. Um, Stellar Wreckage I have liked as a one copy of, and once again, this is great against Collective Company decks since if they try to Collective Company on your turn, you pass it back, you'll have Stellar Wreckage up, and if they try to swing in with their creatures, you cast Wreckage, and in that sense, you should be able to kind of board wipe them on their turn and save yourself. Yes, you'll ramp them a lot, but most of those decks, it doesn't really matter since Collective Company decks, they work on 4 mana. If you give them more mana, it doesn't really make them that much more threats because all their stuff is really low to the ground. So every turn they're usually already casting 2 to 3 spells anyways. So if you give them like 4 extra lands, you know, whatever, right? At that point, their creatures are already small enough. It's not like they're gonna play 8, you know, small creatures in a turn. But yeah, wreckage is like for those type of decks where you want to get rid of it. I'll get rid of their creatures in exchange for mana. You probably don't want to side this against like mono green Karn because ramping Karn is or ramping mono green is always going to be bad news for you because all their spells are just very high, um, very mana intensive, and if you give them more mana, the threats that they can pump out would be very disastrous for you. So this Settle Wreckage is definitely great against a majority of mid-range decks and a majority of the weenie decks, since giving mana to weenie decks don't really matter. But against anything that's high value, you may want to be careful with that. You could use this against like Phoenix, for example. Even though giving Phoenix mana is kind of dangerous, if you can hit like 4 copies of their phoenixes, I would definitely go for it. Like exile all their phoenixes. You give them a bunch of lands, but now they have no phoenixes to um, essentially kind of flash back anymore. So yeah, one set of wreckage on top of the 3 verdicts. Um, like I mentioned, verdicts and farewell are great sorcery speed board wipes. But cell wreckage is kind of like that extra instance in case your opponent tries to dodge verdicts. So um, you can kind of catch them with the wreckage sometimes. And then the last 2 cards, Trawler and Hullbreak Horror. Hullbreak Horror, I definitely still like. I've won plenty of control matchup games with this card. If you're playing Hull against control, essentially you're just trying to build up enough mana so that you can resolve the horror and then control the game from there. You don't want to cast this on like turn 7 if you have nothing else to do with it, unless your opponent's hand is completely empty or they don't have any counter spells or any way to remove this. Then yeah, go for it. But otherwise, I recommend dropping this when you have like 9 mana or something open, so you at least have 2 mana to maybe like counter something and then either bounce a spell or return a permanent. But yeah, I'd be careful with this though. But it's definitely won me some games. And if your opponent's also playing Hullbreaker, you want to be the second one to cast it, so you can bounce their Hullbreaker on the stack. Um, if they flash in Hullbreaker, you should flash in yours on top of it, and then let yours resolve first. Cast a spell, bounce their Hullbreaker while it's still on the stack. So that's one way to kind of use the Hullbreaker. Really good win condition for against most control decks. Now Dream Trawler, I haven't really got to really use it too much. It's supposed to be pretty good against Rakdos mid range since they can't really remove it and stuff like that. Keeps you in the game with the card draw, keeps you in the game with the lifelink, and is hard to remove and kind of annoying to deal with. But at 6 mana, sometimes it feels kind of bad to play it for 6 mana and have it do nothing. It's like playing Shark Typhoon on for 6 mana, and then not being able to create a shark token right away. The same idea here is that you're playing a 3/5 creature that does nothing else on your opponent's turn. You have to wait for one full rotation before it starts doing work. Same thing with like Typhoon, and sometimes that's a little too slow. So you may want to be careful about that when casting the Dream Trawler. But the 1 of is still kind of nice to have. Other thing I forgot to mention about Aethergust is really great against Rakdos right now also, since the majority of the red spells that you want to stop, Hikijiki, Chandra, Bone Crusher Giant, Blood Harvester, all those are great. Even like Kroxa, if they try to cast Kroxa, you can shove it back on top or bottom of the deck. If they're trying to escape it, you can do the same thing. They can pay for the escape cost, and then you can shove the Kroxa back on top or bottom of their deck, so they lose 5 cards from their deck or from their graveyard, and then either have to recast the Kroxa again and then try to get another 5 cards in the graveyard to escape it. So in general, I think Aethergust is just kind of like a must have in this format. So great against Rakdos, great against other Jeskai, Izzet decks, good against mono green decks, good against I wouldn't say it's too good against Bant decks, green white, because the only green card they play usually is Collective Company, so you're better off playing more Dovin's Veto or something like that at that point. But in general, like it's good against every other like um, decks that play green in it, outside of like the Bant Collective Company decks. All right, I think that is it. And this is probably gonna be my final update for the deck. And as I mentioned, I played a bunch of best of threes with this deck, and it's been working fairly well. Um, the sideboard is where I like it to be. The main deck has been pretty good. Maybe you could make one or two small tweaks to the deck, but outside of that, I think everything else is kind of worked as intended. Mana, I haven't gotten too much games where I gotten completely mana screwed. Flooding out can be an issue, but like I mentioned, you have several ways to try to anti-flood yourself. You have the Omen, you can sack Omen, you can Castle Vantress, you can search for Escanta, cycle the farmland, cycle Sensor, cycle Shark. So you have ways to try to unflood yourself, and you have ways to also try to get lands if you're getting land screwed. So um, I think that's probably the correct ratio. So like all these cards help, even though you're playing an 80 card deck, it helps you bring you closer to having like a about a 70 card to close to like a 65 card deck. So um, without giving up um, your consistency as much, and the fact that Yorion can come in later in the game and like you know flashback your Omen, flashback Narset, or maybe the Emperor for more additional value. Really helps the longevity of the deck in the late game, and this deck is designed to get to late game. You want to be able to resolve your farewell. You want to be able to resolve maybe a 6 mana Shark Typhoon enchantment. So majority of the cards here are to help you get to that late game. Granted, your draw variance is going to be a little weird, and then the rest of the cards here are also to help you kind of deal with the draw variance that you might encounter while playing the deck. So yeah, there you go. I think that's everything I can talk about the deck. Um, I might post a couple of videos showing me playing the deck to kind of help those players that are a bit newer um, or don't know how to really pilot the deck. Maybe pilot it a little bit better. But outside of that, I think that's all I have to mention here. But yeah, hope you guys enjoy. And then if you have any suggestions, any comments, just go ahead and leave them down there, and I'll get back to you guys. All right, see ya.